There is a part of you that you do not know. And the reason you do not know it is not because it is hidden from you. It is because you have spent your entire life learning not to look. Most people say they want to grow. They say they want healing. They say they want to understand themselves. But what they really want is to feel better without having to confront the parts of themselves that make them uncomfortable. And that is exactly why shadow work feels so frightening. Because shadow work is not about becoming better. It is about becoming honest. Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And that sentence alone destroys every spiritual fantasy we have about growth. Because it tells us something we do not want to hear. You do not heal by focusing only on your strengths. You do not transform by repeating affirmations. You do not become whole by pretending you are already healed. You become whole by turning toward the parts of yourself you have rejected, suppressed, denied, moralized against, and hidden even from your own awareness. And that is where shadow work begins. Not in ritual, not in journaling prompts, not in aesthetic self-reflection posts. It begins the moment you realize that the traits you criticize most in others, the reactions that feel disproportionate, the jealousy that embarrasses you, the anger you claim you rarely feel, the insecurity you disguise as superiority, the need for control you justify as responsibility, are not random. They are signals. The shadow is not evil. It is simply everything about you that did not feel safe to be expressed. As a child, you learned very quickly which emotions were welcomed and which were inconvenient. Maybe anger was too much. Maybe sadness made others uncomfortable. Maybe your sensitivity was mocked. Maybe your ambition threatened someone. Maybe your neediness felt like a burden. And so, in order to stay loved, connected, accepted, you cut pieces of yourself off. Not consciously, but strategically, you shaped yourself into what was tolerable. And whatever did not fit that version of you did not disappear. It went underground. That underground territory is the shadow. Shadow work, then, is not about becoming darker. It is about reclaiming what you buried in order to survive. And here is the uncomfortable truth. The shadow does not only contain your rage, your envy, your selfishness, your pettiness, your cruelty. It also contains your power, your boldness, your erotic energy, your ambition, your intensity, your capacity to disrupt. Most people are not afraid of their darkness. They are afraid of their magnitude. Because once you access what you have suppressed, you can no longer pretend to be small. So how do you begin? You begin by observing your reactions, not your thoughts. Your reactions. The body tightens before the mind explains. You feel irritation before you rationalize it. You feel judgment before you intellectualize it. You feel triggered before you justify it. The shadow reveals itself in emotional intensity. When someone's confidence irritates you, when someone's vulnerability annoys you, when someone's success makes you uncomfortable, when someone's dependence overwhelms you. Instead of asking, "Why are they like that?" you ask, "What in me is reacting so strongly to this?" That is the first doorway, and most people close it immediately, because to admit that what bothers you in others might exist in you feels humiliating. But shadow work is not humiliation. It is integration. You are not discovering that you are worse than you thought. You are discovering that you are more complex than you allowed yourself to be. And complexity is not corruption. It is depth. If you are beginning shadow work, understand this. You will not feel enlightened at first. You will feel exposed. You will feel resistant. You may even feel defensive watching this video. That defensiveness, that is not a sign to stop. It is a sign you are near something real. Shadow work does not begin with loving yourself. It begins with tolerating what you see, and that requires courage most people do not cultivate because they prefer comfort over truth. So, if you are here, watching this, feeling a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, you are already at the edge of the door. The question is not whether you have a shadow. You do. The question is whether you are willing to meet it without trying to fix it immediately. In Part 2, we will go deeper into the practical beginning. How to identify your shadow patterns clearly, how projection works psychologically, and how to start engaging with what you find without overwhelming yourself. Because shadow work done too fast can destabilize you. But done consciously, it can change your entire life. If you truly want to begin shadow work in a way that is transformative rather than destabilizing, then you must first understand that the shadow does not reveal itself in dramatic confessions or sudden personality shifts, but in subtle, repetitive emotional patterns that quietly shape your relationships, your decisions, and the way you interpret reality without you even noticing it. The shadow hides in what feels automatic. It hides in the way your stomach tightens when someone challenges you. It hides in the way you immediately withdraw when you feel unseen. It hides in the way you subtly compete with people you claim to admire. It hides in the way you become cold when you are actually hurt. And because these reactions feel justified in the moment, because they feel like this is just who I am, or anyone would react like this, you rarely question them deeply enough to see what is operating underneath. Shadow work begins the moment you become curious about your strongest emotional reactions instead of defending them, not suppressing them, not expressing them impulsively, but observing them long enough to ask yourself uncomfortable questions. For example, when someone ignores your message and you feel a wave of anger rising in your chest, what is truly happening underneath that anger? Is it only irritation? Or is it an old fear of being unimportant that you learned very early in life? When someone criticizes you and you immediately feel the urge to explain yourself extensively, to justify, to defend, to prove your intention, what part of you feels threatened? Is it your competence? Or is it a younger part of you that equated mistakes with rejection? The shadow is often not the reaction itself. It is the unmet need that the reaction is protecting. And this is where many people make a mistake when starting shadow work, because they assume that recognizing the shadow means attacking themselves, labeling themselves as toxic, immature, narcissistic, selfish, or broken, when in reality shadow work requires the opposite of self-judgment. It requires emotional stamina. Because you are going to discover parts of yourself that contradict the identity you have carefully constructed. You may discover that beneath your kindness there is resentment, that beneath your independence there is fear of intimacy, that beneath your rationality there is emotional avoidance, that beneath your spirituality there is superiority. And if you approach these discoveries with shame, you will shut the process down before it can integrate anything. Instead, you must approach your shadow like an archaeologist approaching an ancient ruin, with patience, with precision, and without the intention to demolish what you find. Another essential doorway into shadow work is projection, which is the psychological mechanism through which you unconsciously attribute to others what you cannot consciously accept in yourself. And this is not a moral failure, but a natural defense mechanism designed to protect your self-image. When you strongly judge someone for being arrogant, manipulative, weak, dramatic, attention-seeking, needy, cold, irresponsible, controlling, ask yourself slowly and honestly, where does this quality exist in me, even in a small or distorted form? Because the shadow does not always appear in identical expression. If you despise arrogance, it might be because you have suppressed your own ambition so deeply that anyone who displays confidence triggers the part of you that wishes it had permission to take up space. If you cannot tolerate neediness in others, it might be because your own needs were never safe to express, and now witnessing someone who openly depends on others feels almost offensive. Projection is powerful because it allows you to study your shadow safely at a distance through other people, but only if you are willing to take responsibility for your emotional intensity instead of assuming that the problem is always external. However, and this is important, shadow work is not about blaming yourself for everything. It is about distinguishing between what truly belongs to you and what does not. If someone violates your boundaries, the anger you feel may not be projection. It may be a healthy signal. If someone repeatedly disrespects you, your discomfort may not be your shadow. It may be your intuition. Shadow work is not self-gaslighting. It is self-clarification. The difference lies in whether your emotional reaction is proportional to the situation or whether it carries the weight of something older, something familiar, something that feels like it has happened before, even if the current situation is small. And one of the safest ways to begin shadow work without overwhelming yourself is through reflective journaling, not in the form of aesthetic self-analysis, but through raw and specific questions that force you to slow down long enough to access the layer beneath your first explanation. Instead of writing, "I was angry because they were disrespectful," you ask, "Why did this specific behavior affect me so deeply?" Instead of writing, "I felt jealous," you ask, "What does their situation represent that I feel I do not have permission to pursue?" Instead of writing, "I shut down," you ask, "What would have happened if I had stayed emotionally present instead?" The shadow often contains disowned desires. Desires to be powerful, to be chosen, to be admired, to be prioritized, to be dominant, to be vulnerable. And many of these desires feel incompatible with the version of yourself you believe you should be. So, you exile them. But exiled parts do not disappear. They influence you indirectly. They sabotage you quietly. They leak into your relationships in distorted ways. And the longer they remain unconscious, the more control they have. Starting shadow work, therefore, is not about becoming darker. It is about becoming less fragmented. It is about reclaiming the energy you have spent on maintaining an identity that feels safe but incomplete. And this is why shadow work requires pacing. If you try to confront everything at once, every insecurity, every suppressed impulse, every trauma, every contradiction, you risk destabilizing your nervous system because the psyche protects itself for a reason. You begin slowly, one trigger at a time, one projection at a time, one uncomfortable truth at a time. You do not need to dismantle your entire personality in 1 month. You need to build the capacity to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. And that capacity, more than any technique, is the real beginning of shadow work. In Part 3, we will go even deeper into how to integrate what you discover, how to work with anger, jealousy, control, and suppressed power without acting them out destructively, and how to prevent shadow work from turning into self-obsession or isolation. Once you begin to recognize your shadow patterns, once you see how jealousy surfaces in certain situations, how anger rises when you feel dismissed, how control appears when you feel unsafe, how withdrawal becomes your strategy when intimacy feels overwhelming. The next step is not expression, and it is not suppression, but conscious containment. And this is where many people misunderstand shadow work, because they believe that becoming aware of a shadow impulse means they now have to act it out in order to be authentic, when in reality integration means being able to feel the impulse fully without becoming possessed by it. If you notice jealousy, for example, the goal is not to deny it by saying, "I'm not a jealous person." And it is also not to accuse someone or become passive-aggressive. The goal is to sit with the jealousy long enough to decode what it is pointing toward. Jealousy almost always reveals comparison mixed with longing. It asks a very specific question. What do I feel I lack permission to claim for myself? When someone else's success triggers you, instead of spiraling into self-criticism or resentment, you slow the reaction down and ask yourself, if I am honest, what part of their life do I secretly desire but feel afraid to pursue? This question transforms jealousy from something shameful into something informative. The same applies to anger. Anger is one of the most misunderstood shadow emotions because it is often labeled as destructive, immature, or aggressive, especially in people who were taught that being calm and agreeable was the only acceptable way to stay connected. But anger, when examined carefully, is often a signal of violated boundaries or suppressed truth. Instead of immediately expressing anger through confrontation or swallowing it in order to appear composed, shadow work asks you to pause and locate where in your body the anger sits, what belief is underneath it, and whether the current situation is activating something unresolved from the past. You might discover that what looks like rage toward someone else is actually grief over never having been heard before, or that what feels like irritation is fear of losing control, or that what feels like frustration is the exhaustion of constantly overfunctioning. This is why slowing down is not optional in shadow work. It is essential. Without slowing down, you will either repress your shadow or unleash it. With slowing down, you can integrate it. Another powerful area of shadow integration is control. Many people who appear responsible, structured, reliable, and composed are actually operating from an unconscious fear of chaos, abandonment, or emotional unpredictability, and their need to manage everything around them becomes a defense against vulnerability. When you begin shadow work, you may notice how often you anticipate others' reactions, how quickly you take responsibility for situations that are not fully yours, how uncomfortable you feel when you are not in charge of the outcome. Instead of labeling this as simply being a perfectionist or a high achiever, you ask yourself, what am I afraid will happen if I stop controlling this? And often the answer is not practical. It is emotional. I am afraid I will not be valued. I am afraid things will fall apart, and I will be blamed. I am afraid I will feel helpless. And here is where shadow work becomes deeply transformative, because instead of continuing to control everything in order to avoid that fear, you begin to build tolerance for the feeling itself. You practice allowing small uncertainties. You practice not over-explaining. You practice not fixing immediately. Not as a performance, but as exposure therapy for your nervous system. This is how integration becomes practical. You identify the shadow pattern. You decode the underlying fear or desire, and then you make small, conscious behavioral adjustments that challenge the old survival strategy without overwhelming yourself. If you discover that you suppress your needs in relationships because you fear being too much, integration might look like expressing one small preference clearly, without apologizing excessively. If you discover that you withdraw emotionally when you feel vulnerable, integration might look like staying in the conversation 10 seconds longer than you normally would. If you discover that you secretly crave recognition but pretend you do not care, integration might look like acknowledging your effort openly instead of minimizing it. Shadow work is not dramatic. It is incremental. And one of the most important warnings I can give you is this: do not turn shadow work into self-surveillance. Do not analyze every thought obsessively. Do not isolate yourself in endless introspection. The goal is not to dismantle your personality. The goal is to become less divided within yourself. Healthy integration feels grounding, not destabilizing. It increases self-trust rather than self-doubt. It makes you more embodied, not more detached. And if at any point shadow work makes you feel chronically anxious, disconnected, or overwhelmed, it means you are moving too fast or trying to excavate trauma without adequate support. There is no reward for intensity. There is only growth through sustainability. In the next and final part, we will bring everything together. How to know you are integrating your shadow, how this changes your relationships, and why shadow work ultimately leads not to darkness, but to a quieter, more solid sense of self. When shadow work begins to integrate rather than destabilize you, the change is not dramatic on the outside, and it is not something that other people immediately applaud or even notice, but internally there is a subtle shift from reactivity to responsiveness, from defensiveness to curiosity, from fragmentation to coherence. You know you are integrating your shadow when you no longer feel the urgent need to prove that you are a good person, because you are no longer unconsciously fighting the parts of yourself that contradict that identity. You know you are integrating your shadow when you can admit calmly and without collapse that you felt jealous or controlling or insecure without spiraling into shame or self-attack. You know you are integrating your shadow when criticism stings but does not destroy you. When someone else's success inspires reflection instead of resentment. When conflict feels uncomfortable, but not catastrophic. Integration does not make you emotionless. It makes you less possessed by emotion. And this changes your relationships in very concrete ways. When you are not projecting your disowned traits onto others, you argue less about surface issues and more about actual needs. When you are not suppressing your anger, you set boundaries earlier instead of exploding later. When you are not denying your need for validation, you stop testing people to see if they care and begin asking directly for reassurance. Shadow work reduces drama not because you become passive, but because you become clearer. Clear about what belongs to you. Clear about what does not. Clear about when you are reacting from the present and when you are reacting from the past. And perhaps most importantly, shadow work increases self-trust. Because when you have faced your capacity for envy, for control, for pettiness, for fear, for selfishness, and you have not disintegrated, you stop being afraid of yourself. And many people do not realize that one of their deepest fears is not being rejected by others, but discovering something within themselves that they cannot accept. Shadow work dissolves that fear slowly, not by making you perfect, but by making you whole. Wholeness does not mean you no longer have dark impulses. It means those impulses are no longer running your life from the shadows. It means you can feel anger without becoming cruel. You can feel desire without becoming manipulative. You can feel insecurity without collapsing into inadequacy. You can feel power without needing to dominate. And this is where the real paradox appears. Because what most people expect from shadow work is intensity, confrontation, dramatic breakthroughs, emotional catharsis. But what it actually brings, when practiced steadily and honestly, is something much quieter. A grounded sense of self that does not depend on constant validation. A reduced need to perform an identity. A deeper tolerance for complexity in yourself and in others. You begin to realize that the traits you once condemned in yourself are often distorted versions of strengths that were never given space to develop safely. Your anger becomes assertiveness. Your jealousy becomes clarity about desire. Your control becomes responsibility without rigidity. Your sensitivity becomes discernment instead of fragility. And at some point, you stop asking, "How do I eliminate my shadow?" And you start asking, "How do I live in alignment with all of who I am?" That is the real beginning, not the beginning of endless analysis, but the beginning of embodied honesty. And if you are watching this and feeling both intrigued and unsettled, if parts of what I said resonated and parts of it made you slightly uncomfortable, then you are already doing the first step of shadow work, which is staying present with material that challenges your self-image instead of immediately rejecting it. So, here is the question you need to sit with after this video. What part of yourself have you been trying the hardest not to see? And what might change in your life if you stopped fighting it and started understanding it instead? If this kind of depth psychology, shadow exploration, and honest inner work speaks to you, then subscribe to the channel, because this is what we do here. We go beyond surface self-improvement and into the deeper layers that actually transform you. And I will see you in the next video.